The first one is going to be that by Clare PRYOR or Prior, I don't know. Fear, Love, and Christian Plotlines. We have today a little innovation. We asked our speakers to introduce themselves. So Claire, I guess you can start with your presentation.
Good afternoon. My name is Clare PRYOR, and I'm a third-year PhD student at the University of Cambridge, working on the sublime in Latin texts of late antiquity and supervised by Professor Philip Hardy. I also recently presented a paper on the 5th century African life of Fulgentius at a conference in Rome. I did my undergrad and MPhil at the University of Sydney. I'm very much looking forward to presenting this paper to you all today, and looking forward very much to your questions and your feedback. Thank you especially so much to Professor Onorato and Dr. Lax for organizing this series of talks, and to Professor FORMISANO as discussant. I'm also really sorry that I can't get my laptop camera to work, so you can't see my face. Yeah, apologies for this. Do I then just launch into my talk, or will you?
Sure, you can. Yeah. Go ahead, Claire. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So my starting point when I decided to submit an abstract for this conference was a group of Christian narrative texts, which I happened to already be reading in the context of other projects. I then applied to these texts a selection of questions based on the prompts which Professor Onorato and Dr. Lax provided in the call for papers, namely how emotions are portrayed in these texts, in what contexts, and to what narrative purpose. Somewhat to my dismay, what occurred to me when I did this was not a single streamlined argument, but two distinct threads of exploration focused around two sets of strong, even overpowering emotions. And I think when I submitted the abstract, I still thought that I would be able to synthesize those two threads into a coherent whole. That, as it turns out, they are quite separate, so I apologize for this, but I hope that it can be a productive discussion anyway. Yeah, so, and hopefully you can see my slides there. So the first part of my discussion has to do with the many points in these texts where human contact with divine forces evokes a strong emotion of wonder or fear, or fear. The second of these has to do with the way in which these texts portray strong human emotions. In the examples I explore overpowering love or affection, as related to and or affecting the plot at crucial moments of the narrative, and how the Christian idea of sacred history perhaps plays into these portrayals. Fittingly, since when thinking about late antiquity, we are so often working with a framework of continuity versus change, the first of these threads of my discussion largely illuminates continuities between these late antique texts and the classical and biblical tradition. As for the second, I hope to make a case, however tentatively, for the idea that the Christian sense of sacred history is the cause of a significant point of departure from the classical narrative tradition in these texts, which can clearly be seen in the way that emotions and plot relate to each other. And I would be especially grateful for your criticism and suggestions regarding this second point of my analysis. The group of texts which I analyze here ranges chronologically from Juvencus in the early 4th century to Gregory the Great at the end of the 6th. It encompasses poetry and prose. Most of these texts are hagiographical in nature, but biblical epic makes an appearance. The common thread which I see here in terms of genre is that all these texts recount episodes of Christian history in dramatic narrative form. I use the word dramatic not in a technical sense, but to convey the sense that, broadly speaking, these narratives read more like a historical novel or an epic poem than, say, a history or theology textbook, although overt moralizing certainly makes an appearance in, for example, Gregory's dialogues. Since these narratives are set up so as to make us, the audience, invested in the trajectory of the plot and the actions and emotions of the main characters, they are ripe for comparison with the narrative strategies of earlier classical literature. So let me now begin the first part of my analysis. This first section of my discussion comes from trying to answer 2 out of my 3 governing questions, namely, what contexts within the narrative tend to involve a description of emotion, and how are these emotions portrayed? Over and over in these texts, I found a link between divine epiphany or divine presence of some kind and emotion, which is, of course, a commonality between this and the classical tradition. More precisely, emotions are experienced by a character or characters within the text. Sorry, I've already said that. So that the emotions that characters experience as a result of some form of encounter with the divine tend to be strong, even overpowering, and tend to be approximately translatable with some combination of the English words horror, fear, awe, or wonder. They also tend to be described in very physical as well as just cognitive terms. All of these aspects of the depiction of emotion are by and large points of continuity with earlier narrative traditions. We can see these norms for the depiction of emotion established in a few classical and biblical examples before moving on to late antiquity. And in general, thank you, Dr. Lax, for sending my handout in the chat. I've put on that handout kind of basically every passage that I refer to in the talk, and some intertexts as well. So just starting, that they're all in the order that I mentioned them. So just starting with the first one. Virgil's description of Mercury's appearance to Aeneas emphasizes the physiological aspects of human response to divine epiphany. So Aeneas is struck dumb and his hair stands on end. A biblical locus classicus, as it were, of fear responses to the divine are the opening chapters of Luke's Gospel. When an angel appears to Zechariah to foretell the birth of John the Baptist, Zechariah is overcome by terror, and the angel has to reassure him not to be afraid. This refrain of fear not is repeated twice more in these opening chapters as the angel appears first to Mary and later to the shepherds. So that's handout 1B, 1C, and 1D. In the Old Testament book of Daniel, the prophet is terrified and falls prostrate as a vision of God approaches him. The physical and the cognitive aspects to emotion are clearly linked in this passage. Daniel is terrified and he falls down. He is then prostrated with illness and exhaustion for several days. It is particularly noteworthy, and this is a point to which I will return, that Daniel's physical response to the vision is linked to the fact that the divine epiphany forces him beyond the limit of his cognitive faculties. He is horrified by the vision, as he says, because he cannot understand it. Moving to late antiquity, Juvencus's biblical epic, written in the early 4th century, is by virtue of its genre both a melding of both the biblical and the classical canon, and his presentation of emotion is, I think, no exception. It frequently goes beyond what is present in the Gospels and is often given an epic colouring. And Scott McGill, in his translation and commentary, comments on several examples of epic amplification of the original Gospel source text. And I've kind of picked out some emotion-related ones on the handout, but I want to skip straight ahead to the final example of this, which is number 2G on the handout. I've got some passages from Sir Julius there too, which I won't have time to get into, but he, I think, largely does a similar thing. The emotional aspect is amplified in the way that Sir Julius retells the Gospel source text. So skipping to number 2G, this is Juvencus's description of how the women at the tomb react to the angel announcing the risen Christ. His dictis, visis quae animos perfuderet ardens, laetitia attoniti stupor, ac ancipitique pavore. McGill observes how Juvencus creates paradox by combining fire imagery with a verb often used with liquids. That's perfuderat. And we can note as well the piling up and mingling of words of emotion and physical sensation. Ardens, laetitia, attonitis, stupor, pavor. But what is the effect of this paradox? Partly, I argue, Juvencus is grappling with how to portray a sense of emotion which goes beyond the normal experience of emotion. In this sense, it has a certain commonality with the example from the biblical book of Daniel, which I mentioned earlier. Juvencus's women experience an emotion which, in its nature and magnitude, frustrates the ordinary descriptive powers of a text. For Daniel, on the other hand, physical and emotional prostration is a side effect of seeing something which pushes him beyond what we might call his cognitive processing capacity. In both cases, the normal limit of the human experience is being transgressed. This is the logic of the sublime, although a full account of this is beyond my scope here. I've put a very brief quotation on the handout at 3A. However, I hope to show that this idea of portraying emotions of impossible intensity, or perhaps complexity, emotion beyond emotion, emotion plus as it were, is a common feature of at least some of the epiphanic episodes which I analyse here. Whether through word choice, use of paradox, or employing the language of the transgression of limits, the way that extreme emotion is portrayed in these texts consistently evokes these aesthetics of kind of going beyond emotion, the aesthetics of the sublime, to try and express an experience which almost by definition defies the human capacity to process, namely encountering the divine. A useful comparison point and framework for this idea of texts as attempting to portray emotions that go beyond emotion is Alina Stev's work on horror, which she then links to horror in the sense of the modern English genre of horror writing, in pre-late antique Latin epic and historiography. And I sum that up a little bit at handout 3B. A major thread in her monograph is the analysis of passages which invoke precisely this sense of emotion plus, to adapt a phrase from Kathleen Cruz. As Esteves shows, horror and its related verb or adjective forms has a special place in the Latin lexicon of fear terms as conveying this ultimate level of fear. But fear beyond fear can also be evoked by a range of other narrative strategies, such as vivid description of something horrifying, which she links to Enargeia, or conversely, the turning away on the part of the narrator from what is unspeakable. And as I do here, Esteves also makes the link between this overgoing of the limits of emotion and the aesthetics and logic of the sublime. It's worth noting that Esteves' work largely traces this route to the sublime through the emotion of fear, and she ultimately subsumes wonder and awe within this fear-related framework. I'm not sure whether this logic always holds true for late antique descriptions of awe and wonder, but I think I probably can't explore this question adequately here. In any case, Esteves' work on the earlier Latin literary tradition should, I suggest, lead us to consider these late antique depictions of extreme emotion as inheriting a long tradition of interest in what happens, both physically and mentally, when the emotions evoked by a phenomenon surpass ordinary human capacities, and how it's possible to depict that in texts when that happens. We can find some more sudden and powerful reactions to divine presence or intervention in Prudentius Peristephanon. And this is depicted in particular through the reactions of those who persecute the martyrs. So this is handout 4A and onwards. So for instance, in Peristephanon 1, the heavenward flight of a ring and a handkerchief, which symbolize the martyr's ascension to heaven, causes the executioner to freeze to the spot and grow pale with kind of a sense of being stunned. The reaction of Eulalia's executioner in Peristephanon 3 is quite similar. He's stupefied and thunderstruck, and then runs away. And similarly, when Romanus in Peristephanon 10 continues to speak after his tongue has been cut out, his persecutor is horror stupentem. He doesn't know if he's awake or asleep. And again, he's sort of rooted to the spot, hirens. So these reactions of horror and paralysis are highly physical. And the language of paralysis and stupefaction can also be paralleled with the vocabulary and imagery of a plexus, which is in the rhetorical tradition and effect of the sublime. In the wider agenda of the martyr text, these reactions of extreme fear underscore the reversal of power dynamics inherent in martyr literature. By mutilating the bodies of their victims, the persecutors aim to make the martyrs suffer the extremes of fear and horror. But when divine power is made manifest in the mutilated bodies of the martyrs, that extremity of fear beyond fear is instead demonstrated to turn back upon the persecutor. Jennifer Ballingy and Jill Ross talk about how kind of this reversal of power dynamics is very typical of martyr narratives, but in relation to other things rather than emotion. Moving on to Gregory the Great's dialogues. So these are nearly 200 years after Prudentius, at the end of the 6th century. Powerful emotional reactions to some form of divine presence or intervention are so frequent as to be essentially a commonplace. Again, I've kind of just dropped a few passages into the handout. We've got the death of Paulinus of Nola, where there's an earthquake, which kind of shakes everyone with nimio terrore, an extraordinary terror. The deathbed of Romula, a similar thing. Blinding light terrifies all that are in the room, and they're paralyzed with fear. Gregory has a long tradition of late antique Christian literature to work with, and in his work can certainly be heard the echoes of later hagiography, for instance, in his account of bishops still speaking with their tongues cut out, which feels very reminiscent of the Peristephanon and possibly others. He is clearly interested in the role of emotion in divine epiphany, which he understands through a tradition going back to the Old Testament. In Book 3 of the Dialogues, and this is handout 5C, he recounts how the Apostle Peter appeared in a vision to Theodore, the sacristan of a church in Palestrina. An overpowering fear lay hold of Theodore, robbing him of all bodily strength and confining him to bed for many days, unable to rise. When Gregory's interlocutor, confusingly also named Peter, expresses surprise that the saint's epiphany should cause physical sickness, Gregory cites the example of the biblical Daniel, which we've already encountered at the start of the handout. You'll recall that he was worn out and lay exhausted for several days following a terrifying vision from God. Gregory explains this symptom as due to the fact that the mind has seen something which is beyond the body to endure. He says that the flesh is overwhelmed by the things of the spirit. Sometimes, therefore, when the mind is allowed to see beyond its human powers, the body cannot but grow weak because the task imposed is more than it can endure. The language here is theological and perhaps also philosophical, but a reader with one eye on the classical tradition might think of another parallel, Ovid's Semele, whose physical body could not cope with the revelation of Zeus's divine power, causing her death. A basic consciousness of the frailty of the human body in the face of the divine is a common thread in all three accounts, although luckily for Daniel and Theodore, they survive the encounter. Overpowering fear can also be the effect of the holy person's presence on the sinful. When the saint Aquitius goes to visit the official Julian, first an insolent slave, and then the official himself, both of whom have initially a very negative and arrogant attitude towards the saint, are overcome with fear, which again manifests physically. The slave can barely keep from sinking to the ground, and the master is struck by such fear that he trembles and is struck dumb temporarily. In this passage, the portrayal of emotion has a clear didactic and dramatic importance. Julian's transition from disdain to terror to humility is partially focalized through Julian himself, although the narrator cannot resist the moralizing aside "poteva mente." Since as reader and listener we are made to see the abbot through Julian's eyes, we are thus made to identify with the sequence of emotions Julian experiences, and through them to internalize the moral lesson he receives. It's also clear that, as with the martyrs, the body of the holy person can become a site of divine epiphany, in the sense that the terror which the abbot's mere presence inspires in the sinful reveals the divine presence within him. This first section of my analysis has thus hoped to reveal several common features of the portrayal of emotions in response to divine presence or intervention. Powerful emotion evinces the presence of the holy, whether in the form of angelic apparition or divine epiphany or miracles or the presence of a saint. These emotions tend to be sudden and very visceral and physical, causing shaking or paralysis in those who experience them. I think there's also a sense that they appear out of nowhere and strike you. They are uncharacteristic and inexplicable, save by the fact of divine presence. They can serve an important narrative purpose. In Prudentius Peristephanon, they underscore the martyr's victory over oppressive power, and in the dialogues, they are implicitly or explicitly didactic. I now move to the second thread of my analysis, which centers around the question of the relationship between narrative plot lines and emotions. And to explore this, I will leave fear behind and move instead to the emotions of love and affection. And in this section, I have two examples from two hagiographical texts. The life of the African bishop Fulgentius contains several dramatic episodes, including one where he and his co-abbot and devoted friend Felix are captured by Arian persecutors, and this is handout 6A. In a scene which recalls classical epic and historiography's most dramatic displays of love and loyalty between friends, I'm using Virgil's Nisus and Euryalus as my comparison point here, but there are also several examples of something similar to this in Valerius and Maximus, and also you could think of Pylades and Orestes as narrated in Cicero's De Amicitia. So that they've been captured and they're about to be tortured, and Felix attempts to prevent his friend's torture by begging the persecutor to torture him instead. And my analysis here draws on that of Edoardo Ferrarini, who observes that this passage is especially reminiscent of the deaths of Virgil's Nisus and Euryalus. And I've given certain verbal similarities in bold on the handout, where again Euryalus is captured by the enemy, and Nisus tries to save him by turning himself in, essentially. There is a lot to compare and contrast between these passages. The most important narrative similarity, perhaps, is that both Felix and Nisus are actually unsuccessful in their attempts to protect their friend. Fulgentius doesn't die, but the narrative records his torture at length in the following sections. However, the whole narrative framework is, of course, different. Virgil's Nisus and Euryalus episode is undeniably tragic, whereas this episode in the life of Fulgentius fits the overall providential Christian framework of the text, wherein Felix and Fulgentius's torture, which they do in fact survive, redounds to the glory of God. In terms of the emotional tenor of the passages, there are also points of both comparison and contrast. In both passages, emphasis is laid, I think, on the way in which the speaker is swept away by a strong emotion. Felix is vehementi caritate commotus, Nisus is exteritus and amens. And in both, the repetition of personal pronouns and adjectives as the speaker tries to take the blame that's also a common thread and intensifies the emotional register of this passage. On the other hand, and again I'm drawing on Ferrarini's discussion, Felix's speech is structured, though impassioned, with sophisticated grammar. There's a relative clause, and you can note the apposition of inter vestras manus forsitan morturum with estum. So, and this contrasts with the syntax of Nisus's speech, which is disjointed and increasingly elliptical, and conveys his desperation. The Virgilian episode has a tragic pathos which is fittingly absent in the Vita Fulgentii, since the overall mood of the latter is of optimism rather than tragedy. In other words, I would say that while Vita Fulgentii uses many of the same strategies as Virgil does to involve the reader emotionally in the narrative. The overarching worldview of the text ultimately dictates how these strategies operate within it. Moving on to the next example. Felix's emotional outburst, which I just discussed, is certainly important to the narrative trajectory of the life of Fulgentius. But it doesn't, as it were, knock it off course. It doesn't really change the narrative trajectory. It's an important episode within it. But there isn't the sense that Felix's emotion has changed the outcome, because it doesn't. It makes the persecutor marvel initially, but then he just goes right ahead and tortures them both anyway. But the next example from Gregory is an example of a powerful affection altering the trajectory of the narrative at a crucial point. This is a story about the monk Libertinus in Gregory's dialogues, and we're at handout 7. Essentially, he's on a journey and he meets a woman carrying her dead child in her arms. She begs him to revive the child, and is described as acting on the impulse of her maternal love, so amore filii succensa. The saint initially resists, but is ultimately overcome by compassion, and agrees to heal the child. The mother's determination, which is described as pietas, manifests as a blaze of passionate emotion leading to impulsive action. She's succensa. It is not even kind of made more Christian by substituting a more Christian word for love, such as caritas. It is amor. Her pietas is rewarded by the healing of her son, and the narrator praises her for her faith. She's clearly a positive exemplum for faithful petition, despite the fact that her actions initially shock Libertinus. And there are some biblical parallels to this, which I've also put on the handout. You could think of the dialogue between Christ and the Gentile woman in Matthew 15, for instance. In response to the woman's emotion, Libertinus experiences a complex of emotions: fear at her invocation of the name of God, and also of his own possible hubris in attempting the miracle, and compassionate distress, dolor, before allowing himself in the end to be influenced towards the correct path of action by the dolor which her grief induces in him. In fact, the use of dolor here is interesting, placed in contrast to timor. It is as though the feeling has been transferred from the heart of the mother, where it surely belongs, to the heart of the saint. The passage, in other words, seems not just to describe the saint as feeling pity. Gregory could easily have used misereo or miseror, but experiencing empathy in its most literal sense, as if he himself were feeling the pain, the dolor of the bereaved woman. All of this directly leads to the saint changing his mind and reviving the dead child. In other words, the narrative trajectory is towards a positive outcome, and strong emotion is pivotal in propelling narrative events towards that outcome. And there's a sort of larger flow-on effect here. The healing demonstrates the power of the relic of Onoratus's sandal, which is important within that bit of the narrative. So this propulsive effect of emotion in the narrative is striking not just against the backdrop of Christian ambivalence towards affective ties in other cases. For instance, the necessary breaking of the bond between mother and son is the hardest emotional trial of Fulgentius's early turn towards asceticism in the Vita Fulgentii, for example. And I apologize, I forgot to put that on the handout. But it's also interesting against the backdrop of classical literary norms, where strong emotions tend to spell trouble for the plot. This is perhaps especially evident in epic and tragedy. Epics from the Iliad onwards portray emotion as a driving force of the plot, frequently towards tragedy. And I'm especially following the analysis of Delita Agri here. Also Schiazzaro and others. So, for instance, I forget now who who pointed out that in a way, the tradition of Western literature, as we understand it, starts with the destructive wrath of Achilles. The fury-kindled wrath of Aeneas and Turnus casts a shadow over the end of the Aeneid. Divinely induced fear in Valerius Flaccus's Argonautica propels its characters into chaos and bloodshed. Dido's passionate love for Aeneas again kind of knocks the Aeneid off track until it's put back on track, and also ends in disaster for Dido. And as Delina Agri observes, the role that emotion often plays in epic and tragic plot lines reflects a tradition within Greco-Roman philosophy of wariness towards emotions as active forces that threaten to seize control of oneself to the detriment of the individual and those around them. In historiography too, the passions and paranoia of rulers and politicians tend to lead to bad outcomes. I finish by making what is perhaps a fairly bold suggestion. I'm not sure. I will be very interested in your feedback on this. I wonder whether the powerful and powerfully positive role which emotion is shown to play in these two texts reflects the fact that while much of the classical literary tradition has a kind of gravitational pull towards tragedy, or at least ambivalence, both true tragedy and true ambivalence are in fact impossible in Christian narrative. The Christian worldview of late antiquity is one in which all narratives are subsumed within a single narrative, namely that of sacred history, which centers around the incarnation, death, and resurrection of Christ, and of which all other stories are in some sense a reflection, foil, or prefigurement. And that sacred story is a triumphant one in which Christ defeats evil. It is difficult to see how a sense of tragedy or ambivalence can persist in Christian narratives under these circumstances. Yet, at the same time, the depiction of emotions, and especially strong emotions within the narrative, is a key strategy to ensure audience involvement, the more so if they are experienced by sympathetic characters, as well as just the villains, or the non-Christian characters. Given these factors, it seems logical that the relationship between the depiction of emotions and the plot could undergo a sea change in the era of Christian literature. I'm aware that this is quite a broad brush and unnuanced claim thus far, and much more exploration across a wider survey of texts will be required to investigate this. But I hope that I have here made a starting point worth considering. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions and feedback.
Thank you very much, Claire, for this wonderful presentation, very sophisticated, very rich. At this point, I really don't know, Ignazio and Marco, what do you want me to do? Just introduce Alice, or?
I think that it's best to move the discussion at the end of the second presentation.
Right. So maybe, Claire, can you leave the,
yes, sorry, yes, I'll stop screen sharing.
Yeah, go out. Yeah. Okay, so it is my pleasure to introduce the second speaker of today, Alice van der Bosch from the University of Exeter. And she has a paper. I'm sorry, I don't have the title under my eyes, but she will tell us more. Yeah, Drama Queens, of course, the dramatic representation of emotions in early Christian martyr narratives. Thank you so much. Just to be sure, because I haven't been present during the last sessions, how much time does each speaker have in order to present? Because I remember 20 minutes, but obviously I'm wrong.
25 minutes.
Okay, so I was right. Okay, so please be sure, Alice, that you are within the 20-25 minutes. Otherwise, I won't be able to tell anything about both presentations. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor FORMISANO. Yes, and yeah, buonasera. I'm delighted to be take part in the seminar. So thank you to the organisers. Just a quick introduction. So I just finished my doctorate last year, entitled "Creating the Female Martyr in Late Antique North Africa," where I was exploring the various nuances in which female sanctity has been represented by different communities. And currently I'm an associate fellow at the University of Exeter, where I sort of co-lead an interdisciplinary network on different scholars working on aspects of justice and violence studies. And yes, and I'm sort of putting together currently a postdoc proposal for a project on saints in automata, which I'm also happy to answer questions, discussion. Today's paper, or I guess the theme of the call for papers that sort of appealed to me was the kind of martyr narratives, martyr narratives, the actor in the passions that I focus on are full of emotions, and yet often the martyrs themselves seem curiously detached or at some distance from such emotions. So that was sort of what I was interested in, and also drawing on aspects also from my thesis, where I'm interested particularly in the kind of performance kind of culture or performance context of these stories, drawing on sort of dramatic traditions, especially sort of comedy and mime, which would have been sort of entrenched within sort of the early century CE. Yes, so the popularity. So lots of the even though lots of the sort of actor and sources that I'll be looking at, the acts and the passions, kind of sort of the earliest ones have traditionally been dated to the 2nd and 3rd century CE. The popularity of martyr sort of cults seemed to especially sort of take off during the 4th and 5th century CE, and thus been indeed a rich field of scholarship, especially in recent decades. Early Christian martyrs were often admired for their resilience and imperviousness to torture and suffering, sort of often explicitly modelled in the circumstances of Jesus's trial and arrest in the Gospels. As sort of Stephanie Cobb argues in sort of her book Divine Deliverance, they're often sort of shielded from, or sort of otherwise preserved from, the worst kind of pain or sort of assault. And yeah, although they sort of also sort of seem to express strong emotion, such as sort of anger or contempt, there seems to be a similar way in which they're sort of protected from the more negative aspects of these strong emotions. By contrast, other characters in these stories, such as the antagonists or sort of onlookers, react or otherwise express sort of feelings such as fear or wonder or outrage or amusement. Yes. So yeah, in this book today, my initial plan was to look at a variety of different emotions, but I will be mainly sort of focusing on anger here, because I thought because there was enough to talk about, and how the different ways in which it's sort of being manifested by these different characters within the sort of broader context of sort of late antiquity, and yeah, and how this would have sort of was sort of designed to kind of engage sort of audiences. And the kind of to emphasize, and the reason I'm emphasizing this kind of oral or performative aspect is how Christian communities were listening to sermons or retellings of the stories on martyr feast days. For example, as Augustine observes in his sermon on Perpetua and Felicitas, says, when their exaltations and divine revelations and triumphs, their sufferings are being read, we heard them, all of these things recounted in words and illuminated in lights. Yes. So yeah, that's what I'm going to be looking at today. The dynamic we are perhaps most familiar with in these narratives is that the sort of calm or sort of stoic martyr responding to an interrogation, while the judge becomes increasingly frustrated and irate. For example, in the Act of Crispina, the proconsul Amulinus begins his questions from a position of apparent reasonableness, kind of asking her whether she understands the charges and trying to kind of cajole her into making sacrifice to the emperor. The minute she refuses, however, the mask seems to slip, and he sort of calls her a contemptrix or a stubborn despiser, and starts making these various threats. And this sort of and there's sort of physical manifestations, or this sort of idea of sort of losing control, sort of recalls some of Seneca's and other philosophical warnings about controlling the passions. As sort of James Cork Webster's argued in the context of Eusebius's history, this sort of seems to kind of be sort of a way of sort of demonstrating that the antagonist is not in fact aligned with the sort of elite Greco-Roman sensibilities and morals, despite sort of like outward appearances of respectability, but rather it is the martyrs themselves who prove themselves to be the true heirs, like in an updated sort of Christian form. Martyrs then, as in like Crispina, stay calm and consciously seem to be keeping their passions in check, even when provoked. For example, another young virgin martyr, Salsa, is outraged at the sight of the sort of bacchanalic sort of pagan festivities going on in her town, and yet amidst these macabre rites, her the soul of the girl was in anger, but she checked her suffering conscience. While she feels the emotion, it does not come back. It doesn't sort of come out and sort of outburst like Linus. Rather, she first tries to address the crowd, to persuade them to give up their sort of worship. And when this doesn't, and it's only when this doesn't work that she sneaks out at night, and sort of destroys the pagan statue with the aid of a miraculous burst of strength. This self-control, is especially striking for sort of female martyrs, with the additional sort of classical assumptions of femininity being tied to sort of irrationality. Linus, or the sort of judge by contrast, although outwardly representing a supposedly respectable sort of Roman official, exhibits only foolish and cruel behaviour that may have been just as shocking as the female martyr being presented in the sort of more sort of calm and controlled way. Unlike their male counterparts, female martyrs like Crispina or Salsa already have an ambiguity surrounding their presence as martyrs in the first place, and a sort of almost automatic level of suspicion regarding the moral character of such women. To many audience members, the male, superficially respectable proconsul would perhaps be more relatable than a figure like Crispina. And this is a gender tension which, as Virginia Burroughs has argued, invites an implied male listener into a complex dual identification with both the sort of male, in this case, judge, and the sort of female victim. But what about the other characters in text that are looking on at these events, sort of like onlookers or sort of bystanders? The moods of these crowds can often be just as visceral or physical, such as in the Passion of Salsa, where the mob seizes hold of the martyr after they discover her vandalism of the statue. They cut her body to pieces and throw her into the sea. And sort of, she's seized by them as a clamour of all kinds of sounds and fury. And they added this wild savagery by denying her a proper burial. In the Passion of Perpetua, the crowd also respond in anger to some of the martyrs' sort of kind of warnings of sort of mocking them. They sort of become enraged and demanded that the martyrs be additionally punished by being scourged. However, at the same time, they can also seem to have their kind of limits, like as when Perpetua and Felicitas are displayed sort of at first kind of naked. Even the crowd was sort of horrified when they saw that this one was a delicate young girl and the other a woman fresh from childbirth with milk still dripping from her breasts. And so they're sort of brought back again and dressed in these unbelted tunics. Yes, and what I meant to, or I was thinking of doing is in terms of other emotions that get subverted or treated differently according to who's feeling them. Joy, you have sort of martyrs who are sort of singing or otherwise acting exuberantly at the prospect of being martyred, compared to kind of like overeager or kind of failed martyrs, like an example of Quintus from Martyrdom of Polycarp, who I know is very eager to go to his death, but then gets cold feet and reacts. And then sort of sadness, martyrs' relatives either weeping for them, like to try and sort of using their tears to try and persuade them to recant, as with Perpetua's father, who and this is to no avail, although she does pity him. Or else elsewhere, in James, Marion's mother is sort of weeping because her son's martyrdom has in fact been delayed. And this is an indirect allusion to the mother of the Maccabees, who was martyred along with her 7 sons. So what might some of these different representations of emotions have on audiences? What effect, sorry? Like going back to the way these stories are being recounted by and to communities, the kind of aligning of the heroic martyrs with sort of classical Greco-Roman virtues of self-control, such as self-control, contrast them to the antagonistic judge, who only appears to be sort of high status or socially respectable. The idea of sort of directly emulating martyrs, and there is kind of often a sort of controversial one, like, for example, as encapsulated in Augustine's famous pronouncement against the Donatists, non poena sed causa, kind of emphasizing the faith will cause the martyr over suffering itself. Yet, I know other kind of Christians or writers such as Chrysostom deliberately try to evoke their audience's sympathies when they're recounting sort of or referring to the stories of suffering. In a sermon on Saints Bernice, Prosoce, and Dominina, a sort of mother and her 2 virgin daughters who get martyred, he appeals directly to the women in the audience to recall their own labour pains and maternal experiences, and sort of almost echoing the way in which Perpetua's father and the Maccabean mother evoke their own parenthood and trying to persuade their children in different directions and different results. So there's this sense that the martyrs are kind of elevated, like beyond the sort of human emotion, or at least the sort of negative effects of sort of strong emotion, in their ability to stay, because their ability is so measured, and they're able to sort of control themselves even in these sort of dire situations. In a way, they sort of are almost become like kind of automata. And meanwhile, the audience within the narrative are acting with, you've either almost got sort of meta audience, you've got the audience within the kind of narrative who are acting with either outrage or disgust or pity towards the martyrs' behavioural treatment, and offer an array of potential other reactions for the audience who are kind of listening to the narrative being retold perhaps many times on a feast day. So I guess the sort of theme, like as often as Claire points out, often the late antiquity has the sort of continuity and change. In this paper I focused on sort of one emotion in particular, so anger, and some of the ways it's expressed by different characters in martyr narratives, the sort of martyrs, the antagonist, and other sort of onlookers. Emotions in martyr narratives both subverted but also conformed to the classical norms in such a way to emphasize who the audience is supposed to be rooting for, and even or especially if they're a slave or woman, compared to who they should conceive of sort of heretical or just plain stupid. So yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Alice, for also rich and sophisticated presentation. And now, I guess, if I'm correct, I'm going to give a response to both of the papers, and then we can open up the discussion to the audience. So yeah, I'm very much grateful for this for both presentations. As I said before, I was able to read more carefully the first presentation, and so I would like to start with a sort of I know that this is going to be kind of controversial, but still I do think that we must a little bit relativize this dialectic between change and continuity, and because I don't think it is very productive at the end. It is like a vicious circle. Even if we speak with good intentions about change, of course, it's going to be always about a little bit about continuity. I'm not against continuity per se, but I think that late antique studies also need to create other paradigms. Otherwise, they're going to be struck within the classical, within the how do you say, the ever returning comparison with with classical antiquity. I know that the majority of us are classicists, but for example, there are other people studying early Christian texts who are not classicists. For example, they are either medievalists or they are in religious studies. Like I was very glad that Alice was referring to the work of Virginia Burroughs, for example. She's not a classicist, and yet, I mean, she works. So it is possible to work on early Christian and late antique texts without necessarily having in mind this ever-present paradigm of dialectics between change and continuity. So I'd like now to say something about Clare's presentation, and which I found very inspiring. So thank you, Clare. I'm a little bit disappointed that I cannot see you here, but I'm sure you are listening to me. Thank you so much. This was truly inspiring, and I've written some notes. I don't know how those notes are going to be helpful for you. But so first of all, I would like to say something about your perhaps too apologetic way of presenting your paper. I do think that both points are well interconnected. So I didn't see this kind of separation between two different topics. And besides, I don't even think that it is necessary always to have just one thesis. But again, this is not your case, in my opinion. Let me a little bit explain why. So first of all, you talk about the horror, which is caused by, so for example, by divine epiphany. And I think this is a very interesting aspect which might need to be deepened and requires further analysis, because actually divine epiphany, I would say here, in comparison to the classical divine epiphanies, is really touches upon something which is really like a doctrinary kernel of Christianity, right? Because Christianity presents itself as the true religion. So this is something which gives a proof. And so I think that this horror needs to be also qualified with this particular epistemic or doctrinary aspect of Christianity. And also, while you were referring, if I rightly understood, also rather skeptically about the connection with the sublime. So as, for example, Esteve is doing and other people, but also this connection with the sublime perhaps can be relativized precisely through the lens of what you are going to tell us in the second part of the paper. You just mentioned this. Before coming to this second part of the paper, which no doubt is the most fascinating, and I mean, I found it really interesting. I have a question which is more literary, more textual, let's say. Do you? I have the feeling that on the one hand, you are kind of telling us that the texts mimetically, let's say, reproduce this kind of horror, which is the content of the texts themselves, and you were referring to the unspeakable, right? On the other hand, as you clearly show in your text, for example, the life of Fulgentius, there is a certain way of arguing. First of all, it's prose, and you compared this piece of prose with following Ferrarini, or I don't know her name, his name, Edoardo Ferrarini. This is correct? I mean, whatever. You were comparing this particular life of Fulgentius with with Virgil, and you clearly say, okay, Virgil is adopting, which is poetry, of course, and Virgil is adopting a more emotional style, where really we can feel this kind of irrationality, while Fulgentius Felix, in fact, is arguing in a very sophisticated, very orderly way. So I don't think that these two can be really compared, and we have here a proof. So a rhetorical, which is typical of Christian. So many Christian narratives insist on this peculiar rhetorical capacity of changing powerfully what looks like to be evident, but needs to be reviewed through a Christian lens. And now I also come to the second point, talking about in particular Gregory, and the fact that especially in the passage of Libertinus and that mother, anonymous mother, I do think that a peculiarity of this passage is in fact identification between the two at the end. I mean, both are responding to a similar input. Both are Christians, and both we have immediately the feeling, and this is very well explained by Clare, that they are reacting to a Christian narrative. Clare calls this Christian way of approaching history sacred history. While I do understand what Clare means with that sacred history, I would name it differently. François Hartog, for example, speaks of regime d'historicité. So maybe we can talk about regime of historicity. This is another regime of historicity. I'm not sure that that this very definition we can talk later or on another occasion about the particular definition. But maybe it's not really history, but it's more a sense of temporality. So maybe this term might need to be redefined. Okay, I'm sure, Clare, that you know what I mean. So this is undoubtedly the most interesting point which Clare makes in her paper, that this kind of temporality, as I like to call it, change the perception, both the perception of emotions and the fact that we don't have tragedy. So tragedy is not allowed within this Christian way of perceiving reality. So we might say that also retrospectively, if we look to this point, thus to this through the second point of your talk about this sacred history point, this other temporality, to the first point, actually we discovered that both points are, in fact, responding to this different regime d'historicité or other kind of perception of reality. And at this point, I have the feeling that this other, so we have the feeling reading those Christian narratives that everything is already predestined. In a way, we know exactly what the right interpretation is, and this is given precisely because we do adopt a Christian lens. Okay, so I do think that the two parts are very well connected with each other. And now I would like to say something about which is really connected to me on Alice's paper, and also, so I'm very thankful. And also there, I must say that this new paradigm of temporality can be fruitfully applied if you look back. I mean, I like this this combination of these two papers, because I think that they are both responding not only to each other, but also to a need of discovering new ways. At the same time, I would encourage you to be more directly to the point, abandoning this not always useful, in my mind, obsession with change and continuity. But I think that this different temporality helps a lot in understanding what you are trying to say. And then, so I was referring, Alice, to your very perceptive, very precise discussion about the feelings of the bystanders, or of the ones who are looking at those events, both in the Passio Perpetua and in the other texts. I'm particularly familiar, as you might know, with the Passio Perpetua. And of course, there is, I mean, this is a very productive, and I think this is also a typical Christian or late antique, perhaps, aspect, that those bystanders are very different from us. They don't know, they are not entitled to interpret correctly what is happening under their eyes. So while we as readers, we do know, because we are on the Christian side, even if we might not be Christian, but we are in the condition of interpreting. We are given this hermeneutic possibility, okay, that of which people within the text, within the narrative itself, are not given this possibility. So we do know what is happening because we stand beyond this present time. Okay, so we have another possibility to interpret, to rightly interpret, actually rightly in the Christian terms, what is happening within the text. And I think that this emotion, that and this is why I think that you touched upon a very important point. This is, I mean, only the emotions can convey this difference. Okay, so I think I said a lot of different things. Sorry, maybe a little bit scattered, but I hope you got my points, and thank you so much for these wonderful presentations. So I'm done, Ignazio. You will tell us, I mean, we can open up the discussion.
Yes, absolutely.
So
do
you want me to continue to chair the session, opening up the discussion, or do you want to do that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Marco. Yes.
Okay.
Go on sharing.
Okay. So, dear colleagues, you are all invisible to me. Do you have any questions for both presenters, or observations, something you want to add, perhaps? Other don't feel intimidated by my rejection of the change continuity dialectics. I see Fabrizio.
Maybe Claire and Alice want to reply to your observations. I don't know.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Sorry. So Claire, perhaps first, and then Alice.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor FORMISANO, for everything that you've said. And yeah, I mean, I feel immensely helped by what you said about reading the first part of my talk, then back through the lens of the second part. Yeah, that was very reassuring. Thank you. I'm sorry that I don't really have too much to add. You've given me a lot to think about. But yeah, I'm struggling a bit to respond on the fly to what you said. Yeah, I mean, yeah, sorry. Basically just saying thank you. I think that was really illuminating for me. Yeah, I'll hand the floor back to Alice.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you don't need to react. So again, we can continue this conversation also because I'm really sorry, but in 5 minutes I have to leave. So Alice, please.
Oh no, thank you, Professor FORMISANO. Yeah, I don't think I won't go on, but yeah, no, I thought it's particularly about the kind of onlookers and crowds. Yes, as I say, I guess I think they're equally illuminating in the Passion Saint Salsa as well. I think, which is sort of less studied than the Passion of Perpetua, perhaps, but I think no less interesting, as in particularly as I know the kind of mob or the crowd in the Passion of Saint Salsa are both the kind of pagans who kill the martyr, but then they're also the ones that get converted and are sort of the whole town. So I think there's something quite interesting going on.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Okay, thank you. So now we can open up the discussion to the. So I saw Fabrizio Bordone wanted to say something, or just no, sorry, because you made yourself visible. I induced that you wanted to say something. I don't know. Is anyone who would like to ask a question, as I said, or add something? Marco Onorato.
First of all, thanks to both speakers for their stimulating presentations. I have an observation for Alice, but an observation that draws inspiration also from Claire's words. I think that the case of this kind of literary production, for a long time we've been accustomed to focus on the emotion strictly connected to martyrdom, to physical suffering, and to the extraordinary ability to bear it, perhaps also because we are consciously or unconsciously influenced by Augustine, who said that in martyrdom, magna tormenta are magna ornamenta, and therefore the greatness of martyrdom is directly proportional to suffering. I believe that the time has come to reread the passions in martyrdom narratives not only as a tool that strengthens the epic dimension of the story of the protagonist, but also as a tool capable of creating empathy between protagonist and audience, and thus transforming the narrative into an invitation to relive in everyday life the experience of the heroic battle against the enemies of the Christian faith. So I think that it's a very intriguing key, the one you proposed, because empathy is important, is crucial in understanding the peculiarity of these kind of narratives.
Okay, Alice, yeah. Yeah,
no, so, yeah, absolutely. Sorry.
Okay. Any other questions? Observation? I don't know. Would you like to stay longer? I really have to go at this point. Maybe Ignazio can take the lead and continue. So let me first of all thank you so much for having the possibility of being part of this discussion, and I really I look forward to the next meetings. I think that I can be present, and I'm sorry for not being present the previous time, just once, but in a very difficult situation. So again, congratulations, and talk to you soon. If you have any questions, Alice and Claire, glad to talk to you in the future. Okay, take care.
You, Marco.
Thank you. Grazie.
Thank you, Marco.
Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank
Ciao,
you
ciao.
Thank you, Marco.
Grazie.
Thank you.
Marco.
Ciao.
So, any other questions?
Maybe I could say something, and this is, in premise, I want to thank you, the two speakers, for their interesting presentations. Claire, Alice, thank you very much. And I was particularly struck by the reflection on the audience of martyr narratives, on the who is watching thing, who is watching the martyrs, because there is a sort of a doubling effect in these types of narratives. There is an audience witnessing and experiencing emotions on the stage of the diegesis, but there is also another audience, one that re-listens and relieves these emotions, horror, fear, religious fervor, during liturgical events. And it was a thing that opened up a window in my mind. I was thinking in particular about Paulinus of Nola on the Natalicia occasions. And these emotions are thus continuously reproposed. And this is a fascinating point. Also, the idea of a meta watching, of a meta audience that I listened in the Alice presentation, but also in Claire's presentation, there is something about Prudentius and that kind of narrative. So it is a point really, really interesting. Thank you very much. And I don't know if you have also to say about this kind of doubling, Claire and Alice, maybe the doubling of the audiences, and the audience inside the plot and the audience outside, and this kind of repetition of emotional moments. So thank you so much.
Claire, do you want to go first? Do you want?
I was hoping you would.
Oh, okay. I'm happy to. I didn't want to disrupt the order. No, I think no. Thank you for your observation. Yeah, and I think it also perhaps goes into the hermeneutic and the pedagogical sort of tools, like sort of empathy and like reliving that kind of emotion can be like either sort of helping to sort of get across these kind of the messages that they're trying to get across.
Thank you. Other questions?
Apparently not.
I suppose I do have a quick response to the doubling audience.
Oh,
idea.
thank you. Yeah.
Very. I mean, in some ways, the interesting thing about the bit of Gregory which talks about Theodore's vision of the Apostle Peter is that, I mean, maybe this isn't. I mean, this is sort of several audiences in a way, because there's there's several layers of people experiencing things, because there's Theodore experiencing the fear at witnessing Peter, and then there's Gregory and his interlocutor. Gregory understands what's going on, the interlocutor doesn't, and then there's us. And the interesting thing is that Peter, the interlocutor within the text, doesn't understand why Theodore would be weakened bodily from that overpowering fear, and has to have it theologically explained to him that the flesh is overwhelmed by the things of the spirit. Sorry, the more I speak, the less I'm kind of convinced that this is relevant. But I guess maybe it points to this idea that sometimes the emotions that we see others experiencing within texts are intuitive to us, but sometimes they're not. And then what's the strategy of the text or the person who's explaining the text to us or whatever to make us make us understand why that reaction should be the case, and therefore enable us to enter into it? Because I guess empathy doesn't always work.
Yeah, I think it depends on the kind of emotion. For example, there is a very strong emotion that I'm working at this time, disgust. And it's an emotion that can be reproduced by the text, but some things like fear from something that is inside the text, it's difficult for the reader. So empathy works only with selected emotions maybe, and it's fascinating to read how they are yes, they are used also with a sort of an intent and an intention from the writer. So thank you, Claire, because it's very interesting. This it's something that can help us to rethink about the concept of empathy from the text. Maybe there are emotions and emotions. If I understand, obviously, your point.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
As in, can I almost respond to Claire's response?
Sure.
Sorry, it kind of made. Thank you, Claire. No, I thought that was it was a sort of interesting point. It makes think, especially in Salsa again, when she's sort of sneaks out to destroy the statue. She's kind of wrestling. She's sort of weighing up her decision and sort of wrestling with herself. Almost, she's having to, I don't know, either sort of she's sort of out loud, sort of praying and monologuing about, I don't know, these emotions and kind of what's happening to her. So sorry, just another.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I haven't read that martyrdom, and I need to really.
Ignazio, se non ci sono altri interventi possiamo salutare tutti. E dare appuntamento al giorno 17.
Sì, giorno 17 col prossimo incontro che provvedo a condividere. Il prossimo incontro. Allora, scusate che recupero la pagina di calendario. Ecco qua. Posso condividere. Ok, spero sia ben visibile. Le informazioni sul prossimo incontro, 17 giugno, martedì prossimo, next Tuesday, same hour, alla stessa ora, Discussant il professor Fabrizio Bordone dell'Università di Pavia e tra i relatori, oltre al sottoscritto, anche Nicholas Goldman della Università di Gottinga, con una relazione dal titolo Fas est sperare meliora, Avoiding Negative Emotions in Times of Crisis, 5th Century, See and Now, mentre io vi parlerò, se avrete il piacere di venire, di Et ille temporis oblitus, emozioni e racconto del tempo nel Natalicium 6 di Paolino Di Nola. Dunque vi diamo appuntamento alla prossima settimana. per chi vorrà. Grazie Fabrizio, che vedo collegato, anche prima è stato interpellato, quindi ci vedremo martedì.
Va bene. Grazie a tutti allora.
Ciao,
Una buona
martedì.
serata.
Buona serata.
Grazie a tutti.
Buona serata a tutti.
Arrivederci,
Buona serata.
grazie.
Arrivederci.
Grazie.
Arrivederci.
Oh.
Grazie. Bye.
Bye bye, thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Ali.